Book 101 review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He is the author of the book Fear's Power, no other than Mr. Vincent Krivda.
Daniel, thank you for allowing me to be with you this afternoon. I've been excited about this for quite some time.
Welcome to Book 101, Mr. Vincent, and can you please introduce more about yourself?
Yes, Daniel, so I'm a teaching academic in Central Ohio. So, what do I teach? I spent 37 years writing and negotiating contracts with intellectual properties embedded in them. And after about 37 years, I said, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? So I finished a seminary degree and I began to teach. And what I was fascinated both with my business background, which was concentrated in logistics, then the history, which I really loved, and the theology, which I really loved. I said, is there a way to merge all three together? And I was able to do that, I think, in my book that I've recently released, Pharaoh's Power Historical Fiction in the Bible. How the Bible uses the great stories that existed in antiquity. Because think of it this way, Daniel. Let's say you were living in 450 BC in Canaan, and you would have heard a story that later became embedded in the Bible. We know that is actually what had happened. Would that story have meant something different if you heard it back then than if you read it today? And so what I've done is I've taken a deep look, especially in Pharaoh's Power. I've taken this deep look at history and said, what elements do I see in history that find their way into the stories that were told in Canaan, a completely different region, which eventually became part of the Torah, but part of the folklore? Because look, in societies back then, you only had a 2% literacy rate. So, why were the stories written? Well, they were written to preserve the stories, but they were told around the dinner table during the evenings so that we could teach the children how they should live, how they should act, how they should find what they should do when they find themselves in certain situations. More or less, Daniel, how do we live in this present world?
Mr. Vincent Krivda, thank you so much for sharing your books to the world. And what is the central premise of Pharaoh's Power as a work of historical fiction?
Well, what I did was I actually looked at the book of Exodus and said, is there a message that I'm missing? Well, there are. And I think there's messages that we miss. The first message that we miss is in Hebrew. The book of Exodus is named Shemot, which means names. Now, if I told you, Daniel, we're going to talk about the murder on the Orient Express, the name of a book. Of course, what would we look for? We would look for a murder, and we would consider that there would have to be a train. Uh, and so what we've done is we've named in other languages the book of Exodus, when in fact that's not its name in the original Hebrew. Now, why is that important? I want you to consider what I've done in Pharaoh's Power, because I've gone through and meticulously broken down 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. And I'm going to tell you this. What I did find was for the first 1500 years, beginning around 3000, around to 1550 BC, pharaohs were deified upon their death. So, what was going on in the 16th century that was unique? And here's what we find way up in the north, in the Goshen region that the Bible calls the Goshen region, up in the north, the Delta region, we find one dynasty called the 15th dynasty, and they were the Hyksos, and it had a Hyksos pharaoh. We also find in the south the 16th dynasty, which may quite frankly have as many as 19 different warlords or people who were identifying themselves at the same time as Pharaoh. But then we have in the traditional city of Thebes, Egypt, where there was the traditional regnal king who didn't have as much power, obviously, as all the other guys. And he said, we have to change the way we're doing business if we really intend to rule all of Egypt. So they created this fiction. They said, when I die, I'm going to be a deified God. How about if we change the policy whereby at the birth, Pharaoh becomes the incarnate Amun Ra? Now, I break down in Pharaoh's power the history of the agriculture, the history of the politics, the history of the social aspects of power in Egypt to get to this very specific point: Moses. Now, when Moses is identified in the first chapter of Exodus, we have well over 30 names and pronouns, but nowhere do we see the name of God or the name of Pharaoh. In the second chapter, we have that episode where baby Moses is rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, and she saves him from the river, and she intends to make him the king of Egypt after her dad. Now, he wasn't born of the royal pharaonic seed, so we know in Egypt that wouldn't have been possible, but that sounded pretty good to the ear in Canaan. In the third chapter, Daniel, we get to Moses at that burning bush moment that we all know about, where he wonders, why is this bush on fire and it's not burning? And then God says, hey, I want you to go lead my children of Israel out of Egypt. And Pharaoh says, oh, God, why me? He kvetches. And he says, by the way, in the 13th chapter, when I go to the children of Israel and I say to them, now listen to this, what is his name? What am I supposed to tell him? Now, that's important because God doesn't tell his name at that point. He says, I am who I am. Now, Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, Pharaoh, in the 5th chapter, let my people go that we can go out to the desert for a few days and worship Jehovah, Yahweh. And now, I want to remind you about the history part and why it's important. Because Moses isn't approaching a political king, he's approaching the incarnate Amun Ra. And Pharaoh then looks at Moses with this look on his face and says, do you know who you're talking to, buddy? I'm the incarnate Amun Ra. I've never heard of Yahweh. And oh, by the way, and this is the important question that is embedded in the Torah, which we have to listen to. Pharaoh says, "Who is Yahweh that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know him, nor will I let Israel go." It's almost like Moses has been set up to fail because there could have been no other outcome when you're walking into a meeting with a deity and you're saying, "Oh, Pharaoh, these people, they have their own deity. I'm going to take them out of the country. We're going to go worship." Now, that's very important because you finally get to the sixth chapter, which I think is the most powerful message in the second verse. Yahweh says to Moses this: "I am Yahweh, Ani, Yod He Vav He in the Hebrew. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob not as Yahweh, but only as El Shaddai, or the warrior God. But by my name Yahweh, I was not made known to them." That would have, if I was negotiating that, if I'd have been Moses, I would have said to the Lord, "Great, Lord, that would have been nice to have known before you sent me in to talk to Pharaoh, that nobody could have even known your name because you never appeared to anybody by that name before." And I got to tell you, that really diverts the whole question about how you're going to read not only those first 6 chapters of the book of Exodus, but beyond that, all of the additional chapters. Because what happens here, Daniel, is we have embedded into these writings the genre of the day when these works were written: historical fiction. And the historical fiction is true. We have a hard time in the West getting over the fact. It says, well, if it's fiction, then it can't be true. No, 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 no. It's true. And so what we have to do is listen to the messages despite some of the particular elements inside the story. And the message that really should come loud and clear in these first 6 chapters is the same question that Pharaoh asked Moses: "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" And by the way, isn't that the question that we ask every day? Who is the Lord that I should obey him? Why should I conduct my life in a certain way? Why should I treat the stranger, the widow, the homeless, those who are poor a certain way? How do I treat others? Very basically, how should we live in this present world?
Certainly, Mr. Vincent. So let's talk about the themes and symbolism of the book. What themes of power, faith, and destiny are explored in the book?
So, one of them is in the fourth chapter of Exodus. We see that Moses, for example, ends up with a stick in his hand. Now, unless you know the history behind that stick, or the mate, translated as a rod, you would think that Moses is carrying a walking stick or some device that helps him get around. In the ancient Egyptian culture, and I explain this in my book, if you were carrying the rod of Pharaoh and you were a diplomat going into a foreign country and you had the Awanet staff, as it was called, if you had the staff of Pharaoh, all the words that came forth from you were the full force and effect of Pharaoh at that time. Now, that would have been known in the ancient cultures, but has been forgotten by us. So, what I do is I add these historical elements to help make the stories come alive. So, if Moses had a mate, the rod, in his hand, and he was supposed to take it, and it was to be used to demonstrate power in front of Pharaoh, it would have demonstrated that he had the full force and authority of Yahweh in front of Amun Ra, or the incarnate Amun Ra, Pharaoh. So my book goes into some detail to explain all of these little nuances that we would overlook in a general reading.
So, Mr. Vincent, what would be your advice for those people out there who want to write their books?
Well, if it's your story, listen to the voice inside of you. Don't listen to others. Because clearly, I'm presenting in Pharaoh's power. I don't think it's an alternative, Daniel, but it's my vision as to what I see when I read. It's my vision that helps me connect with my world around me. And if someone is wanting to write, what they have to do is forget everything around them. Listen to what their creator has instilled inside of their heart. And despite everything around them, just go for it. Write it. Don't be afraid. In my first book, I will tell you this, the first book, there was one area that was like a major fatal flaw. And I had it published through the indie publishing process, and I got it, and I passed out some books. And then about a week later, I saw that that major flaw was in there. And actually gave a copy to all of my students. Okay.
Yes.
And I'm embarrassed. And I said, what do I do? What do I do? What do I do? Well, here's what I did. I went to all the students and said, by the way, you now have a book that is going to be more valuable than every other book that, or every other edition of this book that will be published after today. And I pointed out the mistake to them. And I said, if in your life you don't take a risk, even at the risk of failure, then you're going to be stuck. Take the risk. Don't be afraid to fail. And if you do fail, own up to what you've done and figure out how to go forward in life.
True. Learn from it, people. As Mr. Vincent said, don't afraid to commit mistake. Failure or make you better in the process. So thank
Yes.
you for your advice, Mr. Vincent. So what will be your short-term and long-term goals in writing?
Well, I'm a teaching academic. And so I think what I do best is look at these Bible stories and help make them come alive. And so I want to take a deeper look at other stories that are in the Bible that clearly, I think, are really based in historical fiction, but figure out what those messages meant to the audience that would have heard them in 400 BC. Now, Daniel, you probably would be asked, okay, why 400 BC? Well, by the way, if the Bible is the word of God, okay, and it is eternally a true work, then it would have eternally been relevant to somebody in 400 BC. I want to figure out what those eternal truths were to that audience, and then figure out a way that we can make that same truth that would have been one of those moments and translate it today so that people can enjoy reading the Bible.
Certainly. So good luck to your goals, Mr. Vincent. So let's talk about the character development and motivation of the book. How is Pharaoh depicted as a villain, tragic figure, or something more complex?
Well, actually, I actually one of the reasons why I go through the history element. So the history, quite frankly, I'm extremely proud of in this particular book and how it's broken down. At times, I don't know if I'm a historian pretending to be a theologian, or a theologian pretending to be a historian, or a logistician who just quite frankly doesn't care. But what I do is I don't paint Pharaoh as a villain, but I demythologize the idea of Pharaoh because we have an idea of dictators and rulers as this omnipotent absolute power. Well, what I do is I break it down to demonstrate how Pharaoh wouldn't have been an absolute despot. Let's just consider the facts. Mid 16th century, you have almost 20 pharaohs operating at the same time in Egypt. None of them were absolute in their authority. So I demythologize the idea of Pharaoh and break that down using solid Egyptian history, where we look at the economic progress in the 42 nomes that existed. Nomes were regional districts, the 42 nomes of Egypt, in order to present an accurate history and then also an accurate recounting of how the stories would have sounded to the ear in ancient Egypt and what they would have meant.
Certainly. So, Mr. Vincent, let's talk about the impact and interpretation of the book. How might the fictional elements affect the reader's interpretation of the biblical text?
I think it makes it more alive and more readable and more understanding. First of all, you know, if you have failed heroes, those are the heroes that we can identify with. If we have heroes who are only like way up there that nobody can relate to, the story loses meaning. If we have great heroes in the Bible, such as Abraham, this is a good one, Daniel, okay? Abraham, on two occasions, tried to pass his wife off, or his wife off as his sister, in order to save his own skin. Now, I don't know about you, but if I ever tried to pass my wife off as my sister in order to save my own rear end, I don't know that my wife would be too happy about that. Now, Abraham did this in the Bible two times, which I think are fictional stories, because what happens in those stories? The questions that are asked are actually very credible and would have prompted discussions around the campsite. First of all, when Abimelech the king went back to Abraham in the 20th chapter of Genesis, he says to him, "Hey, what about my character told you that you could portray this episode on me, which is really not favorable for anybody?" And then the Bible begins to list a couple of questions. To what extent does God ignore the righteousness of a man? Was Abimelech righteous? Of course he was. Was Abraham not righteous in this episode? Of course he was not righteous. So is God going to pour his wrath out on Abimelech? No. Does God equally slay the righteous along with the wicked? These are questions that are asked inside of these episodes in the Torah. If I have clean hands, why am I being punished? Now let's break that down. Let's say we have today a mother. with a child born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. She is going to be constantly asking, because here's what she knows: she knows that the ultimate outcome for her baby now is not life, but is death. She's going to be asking the question: has my God forsaken me? Has my God forsaken my baby? If God is all knowing and someone else sinned, why is he taking his punishment out on me? These are the questions that people ask within a religious setting. Sometimes they ask them in the privacy of their own home when all the doors are shut and it's nighttime and they're searching for solace for the troubles that they're experiencing. And I think what we have to do in the Bible is read these stories again for the first time, but forget what we were taught in Sunday school that they meant, because they provide a much deeper meaning when we gather around them and we ferret out what those questions are and then we apply them to our life.
Very well said, Mr. Vincent. Beautifully articulated. So before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, Food 101, in its fifth season. People, fifth season with Chef Alessandro, one of the specialty chef in our five-star hotel in downtown Toronto. Please do listen to our latest episode. We are reading our letter senders all over the world. So please do listen Food 101 wherever you listen your podcast. So, Mr. Vincent, what message or takeaway does Pharaoh's power ultimately leave about leadership and legacy?
I think in terms of leadership and legacy, is if you look at it, how it's broken down in a historical, clear cut manner, the idea is take your own vision and enact and enable your vision. Don't listen to what others have done or would do. I mean, consider it, of course. Who couldn't say that? Who could not say that? But at the end of the day, you were created in order to be fruitful, to multiply, to grow with power, and that growth is now time to be set forth and unleashed in the world.
Certainly, Mr. Vincent Krivda. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge to the world. And we are looking forward for more and more and more empowering books like this to come. So, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Yes. Um, the you can reach me at vincentkrivda.com and info at vincentkrivda.com, and we can also I'll respond to any emails and questions that you may have. You can download some of the info that I have there from chapters as well as blogs.
Definitely, let's support Mr. Vincent Krivda because if you support him, more and more and more empowering books like this to come. So, Mr. Vincent, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Daniel.
More to come, people. See you soon.